Hello everyone, my name is Kyle and this is my learner language analysis presentation. And today I'll be discussing a little bit about Xue's interlanguage and how it ties into second language acquisition and some interesting findings I gathered from the research. So the language feature I decided to take a closer look at is morphology. So when I took my first linguistics course for this MA TESOL program last September, I was initially overwhelmed, but then as we studied more and studied like the branches of linguistics, I really was drawn to morphology, and I've been able to kind of think about it a lot in my teaching since then, and I'm just really fascinated by morphemes and how, and even from this class now, how second language learners of English kind of acquire morphology. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking specifically at third person singular acquisition, plurals, and past tense, specifically simple past in the ED. Acquisition of those morphemes, specifically in native Chinese speakers. Was most of the research is what I did. So we're going to be looking at morphology in Xue, but a little bit back to Xue. She is 19 years old. She is from China, and her native language, she speaks a Southeast dialect, I believe, and also speaks Mandarin. And she has 10 years of English learning experience, so that dates her back to about 9 years old, which is just around kind of closer to the end of the critical period, which is kind of important. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And Xue is a very communicative learner. She talks about in her interview that she doesn't necessarily enjoy studying grammar, and she likes to communicate more with people and talk with friends and get out and use the language. So I was really drawn to that, and I was curious to see how a learner like her would be able to make connections to certain linguistic features, specifically in this presentation, certain morphological features. So I was really curious about that and drawn to that, and I was also drawn to her because she is a native Chinese speaker, and I have a high interest in Asian languages, specifically with morphology and how different it can be and how difficult it can be for non-native speakers of English from those L1 backgrounds to acquire certain morphemes. So that's kind of why I chose it and what I'm going to look at in this analysis today. So that brings me to, where are we at next? The puzzle. So the puzzle was kind of an interesting thing to kind of decipher. When I got into some of the research, I noticed that age of arrival is can be a thing with immigrants to the United States, of when they arrive and at what pace or what rate they do acquire certain morphemes. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, and I will be looking at transfer from Xue's N1 or native language. I always get N1 and NL confused. So from her native language, and how this negative transfer could be affecting the way she has been learning certain morphemes. And then I will take a look at some lessons or maybe some conscious practice that Xue could do, perhaps some reading for pleasure, which may help her to acquire the morphology. So that was the feature. So I jumped into, let's take a look at some of the data that I uncovered. So I looked at all 7 language tasks, and I looked at errors that she was making across those 7 tasks. And I found that she made 17 plural errors across those 7 tasks. And by plural errors, I mean she added, just calling up my paper here, one second. She would either subtract or add an S. So for example, she would say grammars instead of grammar, or she would say examinations instead of examination, pressures instead of pressure, kind of some of these mass nouns, time instead of times instead of times, apartments instead of apartments. So those are some of the mistakes she was making on the plurals. And she made 7 past tense errors across the 7 tasks. She would often forget to add the ed morpheme on verbs such as enter. She would say China enter the WTO. Likewise, she would say stuff like, I think it's more focus on the privacy space instead of focused. So she made those errors across. And I also looked at, she made 8 third-person singular errors across the 7 tasks, meaning she wouldn't add, she would often omit the S on present tense verbs such as stand. She would say teachers always stand, teacher always stand, and not stands in front of the room, etc. So cashier check, not the cashier checks. So I found those. So those were the kind of the errors I looked at in her language. So here's some interesting aspects I did find. So I'm going to call up another document here. Age of arrival, the age of arrival effect. So as Xue was 19 when she came to the United States, she may be affected by the age of arrival effect. So after the critical period, acquisition of the L2 can become constricted by developmental factors, which is difficult to overcome even in a rich L2 environment. So those that arrive in the L2 environment later in life have used their native language for much longer can experience a stronger transfer effect, which disrupts certain aspects of L2 acquisition, in this case, certain morphological features of English. And this was research-based from an article I read by 2 authors, Gia and Fuse, from 2007. So next we'll talk about third-person singular. So according to the same authors, in a 2007 study, L2 learners may inappropriately drop the third person singular S, as in she like to go to school instead of she likes to go to school. Those would be omission errors, but they rarely mistakenly add S, as in saying they likes to go to school. So those would be commission errors, but again, those are rarely flip-flops. So it's usually they will not add the S to she like, but they won't flip-flop it saying they likes. So that was an interesting point that I found in some of the research. And I think that this coincides with Xue's interlanguage and agrees with the research here that the L2 learners in this case have the knowledge of these morphological categories. Up next, the past tense acquisition. So some of the research I found discussed how the past tense is introduced early on in textbooks, but learners demonstrate difficulty in gaining full control of this structure, even at intermediate or advanced levels. And this can be even challenging for native Mandarin speakers, and this is basically because their L1 does not mark past tense with morphological change. Additional studies carried out by a 1998 study by De Keyser and Ellis say that regular past tense forms are generally associated with low saliency, owing at times to the addition of the voiceless ed. And lastly, the last thing I'll take a look at that I found interesting in the research was plurals, in particular, or the mass nouns. And mass nouns can be nouns such as ices. Will often be ice become, they think it's a mass noun, so add an S, right? Ices. So that can be an example. Another example would be pollutions, adding that unnecessary S at the end there. And again, another one that Xue actually did make, but I found this in some other research. Grammars is a common one that is often made erroneously in in second language learners, interlanguage. And also words like stuff becoming stuffs in the plural, and I thought that was interesting because thing can become things, but stuff cannot become stuff. So it kind of gave me a little bit more of a perspective of like, wow, yeah, how do you explain these really intricacies of English morphology? It really is eye-opening and was a lot. So a lot to process for that, and I'm sure for ELLs everywhere, kind of that specific thing. So I just want to touch on plurals. So additionally, from a 2003 study, the regular plural morpheme, like I said, was attached to mass nouns such as stuffs, milks, snows, ices, pollutions, grammars, and I found that this directly coincides with Xue's three incorrect usage of grammar. How she said grammars 3 times, and she would make mistakes with vinegar, saying vinegars, and it was just not consistent. She didn't have consistent use of the plural morpheme, and this research showed that this is a common amongst native Mandarin speakers. Sorry, this was common amongst native Mandarin speakers, especially in, again, those mass nouns. So next, let's talk a little bit about the relevance of all of this to second language acquisition and the study of SLA. I think it is just relevant, and I have 4 points here. I just want to touch on teacher awareness, student awareness, corrective feedback, and taking on the challenge. So I think I don't know for research, but getting into the classroom, I think the teacher awareness, having the awareness that students are making these errors and trying to find a pattern in the errors can help us to maybe design lessons that kind of touch on making these errors disappear, or not necessarily completely disappear, but having the awareness will help us to, what am I trying to say? I guess to help further the understanding that these errors are happening, and how can we develop lessons to assist them. I didn't say that very well, but I think hopefully my point is being made. And I think the student awareness, so the students can also become aware that they're making these errors, and then try and see patterns in their own language. And I think this can be done through various forms of corrective feedback, which I won't get too much into because that's kind of a different topic, but I think the corrective feedback could be anywhere. Are we looking at like just different types of ways to correct incorrect morphological use, and also just taking on the challenge of trying to better our students' understanding of morphology, and without making it this huge linguistic thing, like you're trying to make it more understandable for them, and that it's okay to make these errors, and that, you know, meaning versus accuracy, that could be a whole other topic altogether. So I think that was the relevance to the study of SLA, and that brings me to my conclusion. So I think in conclusion, I think I can't really draw on one conclusion, but I think in essence we need to take a look at the bigger picture, like how to address lessons that will further the acquisition of morphology. In looking at third person singular, it is helpful to know that this is one of the last morphological features acquired and may simply take years, as suggested in the readings. And looking at ways to adjust issues like this in the classroom, it would be beneficial to design lessons around third person singular, pairing Xue with a more advanced interlocutor, analyzing their speech and scaffolding, and offering corrective feedback in one-on-one teaching opportunities with a learner like Xue. So in analyzing further how Xue responds to certain forms of corrective feedback, prompts, etc., and scaffolding, a more detailed plan can be put into place for her continued language learning. It is also important to remember, as the research thus far suggests, that these morphemes take time, patience, and perseverance to acquire. And having this sensitivity with Xue's language transfer will help create a more empowering, rigorous, and positive environment for her studies. So with that, I do bring up questions. So, and kind of, I want to open up a discussion. If you have any comments or suggestions about where do we go from here, I would be super interested in hearing them. And if you have any ideas of lessons for third person singular or past tense forms or anything that deals with these morphemes, I'm all open. And I know I apologize for not explaining myself very well in the relevance to SLA there, but I think I kind of covered it in my conclusion, and I will wrap up here because I'm going on 16 minutes. So thank you all for watching, and I wish you all the best as we finish up this class, and good luck with your papers. Bye-bye.